Hi, Takunda, can you hear me?
Hello, Yvonne. Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, good. Thank you.
How are you?
I'm all right. How are you doing?
I'm very well. You look very sharp. You look like you're actually dressed to go somewhere.
Now, unfortunately, I'm stuck in my room.
Yeah, right. We're just gonna give it a few minutes, just so that some people who are still trying to log in can find their way in.
Okay.
And then
All right.
we'll
Thank
kick
you.
it off.
I'll go on mute for a minute.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Cheers.
All right. Morning, everyone. We're just going to wait for an extra minute or so, just so that people can find their way in. More and more people keep logging in, so just want to make sure we have everyone inside. Please feel free to use the group chat for your sideline discussions and any questions you might want to throw in there as we go along. Also, just to say good morning to everyone, that's also nice. All right, I think 5 minutes is enough. We can go ahead and start. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name is Takunda Mjuru. Today we are going to be discussing a topic by the name of what I call the mandatory fourth industrial revolution approach. And this is basically a set of high-level recommendations to boards of directors and executive teams with specific focus areas for how they should now start putting their efforts towards drawing value out of IT in their organizations. So I'm going to take a moment to introduce the panelists that we have today. I'm going to start with Tatenda. Tatenda Savanu is with us today. He is former Standard Chartered, former GetBucks here in Zimbabwe. He has a finance background and C-suite leadership. Tatenda, thank you for being with us today. I am not seeing you though.
I'm here, Taku. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for being with us today, Tatenda. All right. And then next up, we have Siobhan Rafi from 91 in South Africa, formerly called Investec Asset Management. She is their human capital business partner over there currently. Thank you, Siobhan, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. I really appreciate it and welcome.
Good to be here. Morning, everybody.
And then we have Yvonne Kuimba. She is with Econet Wireless Zimbabwe. She's the general manager for portfolio management and service delivery, also based in Zimbabwe. Yvonne, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us and welcome.
Thanks very much, Taku.
All right, so we'll get right into it with our first focus area. We will have or maybe just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. We're going to have panelists going through a little talk or a little presentation one at a time. And then afterwards, we have a discussion sort of set up. Panelists bring in contributions and questions, and then the floor itself, you guys, the audience, coming in with your questions and contributions. And I would also like to encourage you all that throughout the event, you post whatever questions you may have in the public chat, and then we'll just be picking it up as we go. We'd like to make this as interactive as possible, not just sitting through a lecture kind of situation. All right, so first up, we have Tatenda, and he will be talking about the focus area that is concerned with the overall perspective of IT. That's IT governance and IT leadership. Tatenda, are you ready?
Yes, Taku, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It's quite an honor, I think, to be invited to contribute and be a part of a panel to discuss such a pertinent matter. I think in view of the expanding contribution of IT into overall success of various businesses, in these times of COVID-19, it's indeed something that we definitely need to discuss. As you can see, I think during this COVID pandemic, IT companies and e-commerce companies are the ones that actually top the list in terms of companies that delivered the most value to their countries, to their clients, as well as to their shareholders. Amazon and Zoom quickly come to mind on the international stage. Whilst locally, I'm a favorite of Fresh in a Box in terms of what they've done. They've really, taken the bone out of the mouth of the big FMCG companies and really set the tone for what business will be, post COVID-19. Our discussion here today is pertinent and has implications for various types of organizations. So I'm hoping that as part of the people that have joined us on this will be some, captains of industry and big players within the private and public sector, because I really think they can actually draw a lot of value from this discussion. So without further ado, Taku, maybe you can help me just post some of my slides onto the screen so people can follow. It's not too much, just very high level notes to guide me in the discussion. Yes, so thank you for that, Taku. I can, on my end, close. I can close my presentation there. Yes. So I think first and foremost, our discussion here, the background is on the document that was published by Mr. Takunda Mjuru, who's a strategic IT consultant. And I think there, Taku puts forward the need for an expanded role for IT in terms of what is going on at the executive leadership and as well as from the board committees. I think Taku is suggesting that due to the strategic nature of IT and IT investment, that it be looked at as a strategic item on the board's agenda rather than an operational one. I think a lot of the times now, IT issues are discussed under business development or part of the operations, but it needs to be a separate committee by itself, similar to the space that's granted to finance and audit committees on boards. I think that's one of the most important committees. If you ever get onto a board, everyone wants to be on the finance and audit. That's where all the big decisions are made, even to do with IT. So maybe, the first thing I got from the discussion, Taku, was that, and from the paper that you published, was that we need to have a separate IT committee, probably headed by the chief investment officer and the rest of the board members, being members there, so that it gets the correct level of focus within the organization. Moving on to our first slide there, Taku, would be the issue of IT governance. What is it exactly, and why is it important? There were a lot of definitions that came up, and I think that one is a bit long. But this morning, something really hit home, and that one was quite simple. Someone just said it was a system that marries IT strategy and the overall business strategy. And for me, I think that really speaks volumes to exactly what it is, IT governance, and that speaks into leadership. The next slide there really gives a pictorial view of exactly what IT governance is. As you can see, there's various board committees that will obviously touch on various aspects of the business. But I think the larger part of that pizza there is actually IT governance feeding in. Contemporary organizations will find that a lot of their sales is probably coming from online, if not the sales directly, but the marketing aspect is definitely being done online and has an governance, an IT governance perspective that needs to be taken into account. Traditionally, the classic IT, governance or the roles, how we roll out projects in organizations, stems from the board, where usually it's a finance and audit committee or business development committee that then identifies, anticipates key IT requirements and trends, and with a view to looking at what is happening in the future and where should we direct our dollars and cents, and how do we get the best return on investment from that. And then I think the second level there is something that's taken through to the managing director. He then cascades it through into the organization. A number of work teams are then created with IT staff as well as business liaisons to bring into to fruition whatever issue that the business is trying to achieve. So if they're trying to create something with the HR team or with the finance team, they then sit together with IT and governance. But critically in the process there is decision making. How much decision making power is left to those small teams, or they have to cascade things upwards. So generally, when you then speak of IT governance at that level, you're speaking of who does what within the organization. I'll then move on to the types of IT frameworks. I didn't create a slide on this. I think it's just something I wanted to speak about. There are a lot of IT governance frameworks, and I think in Zimbabwe, not many organizations are using them. Number one, I think, is due to the cost and limitations on foreign currency. But they're generally about three. That's COBIT, ISIL, and FAIR. A lot of them are quite expensive, but I think this discussion doesn't focus on which framework we need to choose. Rather, this discussion is what processes as a leadership we need to go through to ensure that we instill proper IT governance and IT systems. More so from a governance perspective, I think it's about protecting our consumer in terms of data integrity, security. It's also about protecting the general stakeholders. I think every time there is an issue around IT companies and their services, it really does blow out into the public domain. I'll identify the issue of Econet last year. I think that's a financial issue, but it's really changed, how we move money across the country. And that's one of the issues that could have been dealt with from an IT governance framework that then anticipates if there are going to be any future problems, not just with your shareholders, but your general stakeholders looking at, in that case, they sort of generally look at the Reserve Bank. We'll move on to the next one. Tuck, if you would mind. Okay, where we are now speaking of IT leadership. I think a lot of these things have to do with how leaders at the top, as the executive or the management or the board, moves the organization forward. So we see what general IT management is, one who barks instructions and at sometimes creates silos because you are saying people do only this and stop there. But if we look at IT, and I'll give the example once again of Econet, where one of the key things that they say in their mission statement is that they're inspired to change a world. So IT leaders and leaders in general need to inspire change, need to inspire their businesses to move forward. An IT leader is one who is collaborative, puts together various people, various teams to actually come together and meet the same vision and mission, as opposed to an IT manager. An IT leader is someone who doesn't keep the data to themselves, but rather enlightens the rest of the team or the rest of the organization if we're dealing at a board level. So here in terms of enlightening, I think it becomes very pertinent that a lot of CEOs need to be having town halls. I don't see this in a lot of local and regional companies, but international companies certainly engage in this, so that everyone right down to the shop floor knows exactly why there's such a big investment in big data, why there's such big investment in IT infrastructure, which then speaks to point number 4 there, where an IT leader comes out and says, this is the vision that we're setting for the organization. The last 3 there, those points, I think in the interest of time, I will just put them all together. One has to be empathetic, flexible, and compassionate. That speaks to the soft side of IT leadership and of leadership as a whole. In Zimbabwe, I see, due to past experience, we deal with IT as just a, a subunit of the business, the guys in the back end. But we forget a lot of the times that the guys in the back end have feelings. I think all the IT guys here will attest that, yes, you do have feelings, and those need to be taken into consideration as we manage the business, as we lead the business into the next big thing or the next big project. And to see, IT specialists as individuals and not just, IT guys at the back. I think that needs to really come to the fore. The country has lost a lot of IT professionals, and I don't think it's merely just the dollars and cents. It's also an issue of the soft issues that we could have used to keep them into the country and actually benefit from them. If we can move on to the next slide that speaks of business in the COVID-19 environment. So COVID-19 has done something that I think time was going to do, but at times we have situations that force us. And I'd just like to share maybe a light moment. In one of the organizations I work for, we came in as middle-level management, and the leader there, the head at the time, only gave desktops to everyone, and laptops were more of a status symbol rather than tool of business. You'd only get that if you were promoted to a certain level. So I guess if someone held on to that view, as time went, it would force you to then give laptops. And imagine if that organization, everyone was still working on a desktop, and then COVID-19 came along. You would definitely have to change and rethink your strategies there. So now, more than ever, a laptop becomes a basic need in terms of what you need to achieve your goals, to achieve your objectives that you've been sent by management. So COVID-19 devastated a lot of sectors, particularly air travel and hospitality. They couldn't necessarily innovate their way out of that. But I'll speak for FMCG and banking and finance, where one had to merely extend their offering to make it more efficient, to make it more palatable, more attractive to the users. I was previously Chief Operating Officer of a small bank in Zimbabwe, and what we found during the lockdown period was that consumers actually used more and more of the mobile banking apps more than ever before, shying away from actually using the bank. So it's something that time would have done, but I think right now COVID has brought it to our doorstep, and it's important for us to then innovate around that problem, and for leadership to be there to quickly realize that and provide the type of product and the type of application that the clients want. Education, I think, is something that has really experienced a rebirth. I think all of us right now, we're sitting in our homes, but we also have a second job. I think a lot of us now teachers and headmasters at our houses there. But it's generally something now, distance learning has become a norm rather than the exception. So I think it's something that might not change that much post-COVID. Yes, children will go back to school, but we're always going to have the option of e-learning, because some children have actually done much better under their parents' wing than at school. I know a lot of parents don't want to hear that, but it is true in some cases. So it is something that we need to embrace and move forward, and realize that IT and e-commerce, as well as digital sales, is and will become the new frontier going forward, and that businesses will be transformed and changed in the future. Maybe on to the next slide there, Taku, so that I don't know how I'm doing for time. Sorry, you're on mute, Taku.
Sorry,
just
you
know how much
can go
more
ahead,
time I have.
Tatinda, please go ahead.
Okay, no, thank you. So on this one, I think we're going to bring to life the issues that we've just spoken about, which was more of a theory. We'll speak of companies that I think have done well on the IT governance side. I think first and foremost in my brains is Standard Chartered. Standard Chartered has been right at the forefront of leading the change to paperless, leading the change to moving the platform to an IT-based platform. In 2017, 2016, they were really pushing the IT agenda, where all transactions had to be done online. At that time, I thought it was a very bad idea, even though I was part of the organization, to move all the transactions online. But look, in hindsight, it was a brilliant plan. It was a brilliant move, which also delivered returns to their bottom line. because now I think in Zimbabwe you see they have, I think if it's not 2 or 3 branches in the entire country, but remain one of the largest banks, and that is on the back of an IT leadership that has been governed by strong principles, strong issues on the protection of data and the system stability. I think that's one of the most stable systems in the country in terms of the banks. Internationally, you also talk of Uber, one of, if not the largest transport company that has no cars, but the data governance structures that they have there, actually protect the clients, whereby Uber knows exactly where you are. If something is to happen to you, you can actually press a panic button and the police is alerted and they come and assist you. So you do see that the governance structure has gone all the way down to protect the client, to protect the stakeholders. And it's something that has been done at a senior level and has been cascaded down to actually benefit everyone in the organization. EcoCash and M-Pesa, I think we spoke of the issues that EcoCash had last year, which were not desirable, but I think a formal process of IT governance needs to be instituted, and anti-money laundering is one of those key things that has now come up in the past 5 years in finance that all banks and finance houses need to look at, and it's something that needs high level attention. It's not now a business unit, but it must form part of the board committees that need to champion the need for anti-money laundering, the need for proper KYC. I remember last year people would just buy Econet registered agent lines on the counter without necessarily going through any vetting of any sort. And I think those are the issues that EcoCash had at that time, but I think they are working through that process. And Fresh in a Box, lastly, is one of those organizations that gives us a picture into not necessarily having a formal IT governance structure, but going through the actual processes still gives you the intended results. It's also one small organization that has been able to mine the data that they've received. They're able to know how clients respond if they're on iOS phones, and how clients respond when they are on Android phones, and that is something that speaks to their board, or maybe the entrepreneur right at the top, understanding the data that he's receiving and understanding the various touch points of his business that they can use. So I think those key examples are very pertinent to IT governance overall. And lastly, I'll speak of Getbox, a small microfinance bank in Zimbabwe, where it became very important for investment into IT, because suddenly, due to COVID-19, you had more and more people wanting to use the mobile platform. And at the same time, you had more and more people wanting to access loans in Zimbabwe via the mobile platform. And one thing we then discovered is that convenience, is something where people were willing to pay a premium for, even more than the pricing or the interest rate of a loan. So now, what is now more important to the client is the convenience that you're able to give them, and not necessarily the price in the world that we live in. I think that's also a COVID related issue, where if someone can access a product or a service in the comfort of their own home, they would prefer that, even if it costs an extra $1 or $2. So it speaks to what business is going to look like going forward post COVID-19, and businesses and boards in particular, because that is where the tone and the strategy of the organization is set, need to bring IT and IT governance to the fore through initiating leadership. Let's move on to the second last slide there, Taco, if you may, where we speak of the critical steps to IT leadership. I think for boards, I named it, they need to expand their thoughts on IT leadership. And for me, that is done by reading widely, because, leaders are readers. And a lot of the stuff that we get here, that we understand about IT and leadership, come from reading widely, where you get issues on thought leadership. What is going on in the US that we can bring into Zimbabwe? What is going on internationally that we can actually form as part of our vision and organization? So for me, I think boards need to expand their understanding of IT matters. A lot of board members that you speak of, if you say IT as a service, someone looks at you a blank face, but that is possibly the chairman of an organization. And that, I don't think that is the optimum situation. We need to consciously, maybe at management level, educate our boards on what are all these IT issues, so that we have a robust discussion at a board level and at an executive level as to what exactly we're trying to achieve. The boards need to become visionary. We need to see beyond. Sorry, you've gone onto your own slide there. Yes, yeah. I was talking about being visionary, and he goes onto his own slide. So I guess that is the visionary leadership we speak of, Taku. So becoming visionary, inspiring the next generation, working together as a team, all the way from the top to the bottom. And for me, being enlightening, coming out to say, look, as management, we don't know, too much about this, but we have experts within our organization. So I'll move on to also what management needs to do. I spoke of, for me, it's not really about the hard issues that are there, but the soft issues to me become more important when you're dealing with people. Being empathetic, flexible, and compassionate. In terms of techniques, I'll just speak of scrumming. One thing I found very useful when managing IT, so that if you run it as a project and you want to see the result, as management, you might not have the technical expertise to understand the processes that your IT team would have gone through. But if you break it up into small bits, to say, today we're doing task 1 and it's got 3 days, you are also able to walk the journey with the team. So you've scrummed it and you've broken it up into little bits and pieces. It makes it easier to manage from a day-to-day and operational management point of view, and also you begin to see the results. If you wait for the first quarter or the first half, the guys will just pitch up at the next meeting and say, we're unable to finish the project because finances were not permitting. But you had finances that could have gotten you to a certain level. So it's important, I think, when you lead, to do that. And I think lastly there, talk on to the next slide, we speak of what needs to be done to get the organizations through this leadership heard. And lastly, I think the 4IR approach, as Mr. Mjuru spoke about in his presentation and his publication, it is important for business to approach their investment, to approach their HR and appointments and employment from a fourth industrial revolution type of approach, whereby everyone needs to know that IT is the next big thing. It is what is going to grow our businesses. It is what is going to make our businesses thrive. We need to ensure that investment in IT is given against expected returns. There's been a lot of investments, and I will not mention any companies at this point, that have put in a lot of money into IT because they don't want to be left by the train. But they didn't really go into it from a strategic point of view. They did it because company X was doing it. And because of that, they lost a lot of money. And the board there needs to be held accountable. And for me, there, it is something that not only has to be done top to bottom, but when we say this is what we're going to invest in, we need to know, is that what our clients actually want? I'll speak of an issue where I consulted once, and even as a consultant, I thought it was obvious that we need to create a mobile banking application. But at that time, it was in Uganda. We then noticed that a lot of the clients there actually did not have smartphones. What they did have were what people in Zimbabwe term, Kambudzi, and they actually really wanted the USSD codes. So before we, put in a lot of money because Econet is doing this and Telecel is doing that, what does your client want? And is your client able to access those things? So at times, having IT leadership does not mean getting the best app on the market. It means getting the app that your clients actually use to the optimum levels. It is then critical, for that to form part of the overall business strategy. And I'll speak again of creating high-level awareness of IT issues in management through reading widely and understanding all of these things. And lastly, the review of HR issues around staff. As a country, we've gone through a lot of brain drain and lost a lot of critical staff that I think we could have retained if we have a strategic rethink around the HR people and the HR employees that we have, and strive to do as much as possible to keep them on our payroll, not just on our payroll, but as part of the team that moves an organization forward. I think that is all from me at this point. Mr. Chair, I yield the floor back to you.
Okay, Tatenda, thank you very much for a very detailed presentation and talk there. Before I open up the floor, I just wanted to throw in some apologies that we have. We were meant to have an additional panelist by the name of Simbarashe Maponga from the US, from Goldman Sachs. He couldn't make it, unfortunately. Then we were meant to have Nqobile Munzara as our host today, but she also couldn't make it. And I've got to tell you, with regards to Ngo, me having to play host and panelist, there's a big pair of shoes to fill up there, but I hope I do it justice. But Tatenda, thank you so much. I suppose I'll take the lead with asking you the first question. If you look at, if you compare the Western world and the more technologically evolved workforces that they have there and organizations and such, comparing to the situations that we have most of the time in Africa, you really don't have C-suite posts like, your chief technology officer, your chief information officer, except for in, full-on tech companies and everything. But given the expedited situation that we need to have digital capabilities pretty ubiquitous, how soon do you think that Africa is going to catch up on this notion as a whole? I mean, you have places like East Africa, West Africa, where they're sort of pushing pretty hard with that, and in South Africa as well in some instances. But as for the rest of Africa, because this problem is everyone's problem, it's not just, those three regions or whatever. So how soon do you think, as Africa, everybody is going to sort of catch on to that?
Look, I think Africa is definitely one place where we're focused on our leadership, and leaders then really know that it's time to actually pull up our socks and bring IT to the. So I don't think it will take a lot of time. At this point, I just want to speak of the finance sector and give kudos to the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, whereby they're actually very determined on knowing that you have the correct person in the correct position from an IT perspective. It's actually one of those things that the Reserve Bank has to sign off on in terms of the head of IT or a chief technology officer. So I think other regulators also need to come in to say, look, you need to have an able chief of intelligence or chief technology officer at the top to understand the business and to move it forward. So it's not just about regulation, but actually looking forward to say, what can this person deliver? So I do think other organizations and regulators will follow suit to what the Reserve Bank has done. And I think in Zimbabwe, you can see the fruits of that. A lot of the organizations and even, your micro lenders actually having IT systems that are quite robust. We haven't had any issues of cyber fraud and so forth. And that's because of the strong systems that the regulator has advocated for. In the same vein, I'll speak of one of the things that they've requested. I think as of December, all banks had to submit cyber fraud and cyber risk policies to the Reserve Bank for them to see if your policy is there, number one, and whether it is adequate to protect your clients. So I think that's really a step in the right direction from the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. I'm looking forward to other regulators coming forth to say, this is the standard that we've set. So I'm pretty confident that we will get it right. But I think we also need support from government to actually put all these things in place, these minimum standards in place, so that we're able to move forward.
Okay, thanks for that. We can have some questions come through from the rest of the panelists or the audience. If anyone has anything burning to ask Tatenda from his presentation or contribution.
Hi, Tapo. I've got a question for Tatenda, or perhaps a comment that he can expand on. So I was listening quite with interest on your comments regarding more established African businesses, but I'm just thinking, bearing in mind that the majority of Africa is informal in terms of the business and the transactions that actually happen. Would you say within the IT governance policy and strategy, it's quite important to start to capacitate that particular industry. Bearing in mind that COVID-19, as you say, really accelerated the fact that a lot of informal industries had to be stopped short. What is the best way for, I don't want to call it big business, but for the larger industrial giants to be capacitating the informal markets, given the high portion of the economy that it takes up?
Okay, thank you, Yvonne. I think, yes, that's a very pertinent thing that you asked there. And I think when I spoke of the word collaborative, maybe I didn't expand on it too much, but collaboration is more than just teamwork between, us as friends and workmates. Collaboration expands beyond the organization. So it's important for these large organizations to look at themselves and say, who is our supply chain? And who are, our end users? Because sometimes, it might not be obvious exactly who's, using your product, and who's benefiting from your product. So as a large organization, you need to that area. So why I like Fresh in a Box, they went in where the big players should have been there first. So in my mind, OK, needed to be there first to actually be there for e-commerce and delivering groceries for our door. But they just kept on opening their doors till 7 p.m. instead of expanding that to deliver right to your doorstep. So this is where, a large organization can come in and actually help the informals to say, okay, now fine, we now have a delivery service, but that delivery service is done by, our supply chain or the small businesses. And I'll give the example of Mr. D Food example in South Africa, where instead of them, delivering food, all those people on bikes that you see in South Africa bringing you your burgers and pizza are actually small businesses that they have then outsourced and created another business that is informal, but with the tag of Mr. D, so that you trust it. Because if it was Tatenda bringing your pizza, you'd say, no, thank you. But they've tagged it, Mr. D deliveries and so forth, and created a business and a whole new, chain of businesses under that. So big business needs to look at themselves, not just from their bottom line, but effect triple bottom line, where you say, what am I also doing for the society? What am I doing for the environment before I look at, the dollar that has gone into my pocket? So it's actually time for a strategic rethink, like I said, and I think Mr. Mjuri has proposed for big business to look at themselves as an enabler, not just for technology, but an enabler for empowerment and for the growth of businesses. I hope, Yvonne, I have answered your question with that.
No, thanks very much. I really wanted to bring out that point around, ecosystems partnerships, particularly given the way we've got more and more global challenges affecting everybody. And when the small player can't operate, it actually affects even the big businesses themselves. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Yvonne.
Thanks, Yvonne. We've got two questions that are coming in from the audience. One is a bit long-winded. It says, how can organizations practically, in brackets, especially through leadership, make IT the enabler of better customer experience systematically so that IT becomes the means to the end and not the end? It seems to an extent that now the rush conversation is, let's implement this tech, where channel market fit sometimes is questionable. In other words, how can we as leadership ensure that we're not implementing tech for the sake of going digital? And how do we put the customer or stakeholder right at the center from board level? That's the first one.
Yeah. Yes. No, I think I understood, and I think there's a frustration there that's coming out. And look, I think it's there in a lot of organizations. Like I said, you ask a board member, to say, IT as a service, and someone looks at you blank. So clearly, when that option comes up, that person is not going to be fully engaged. What they are then doing is just having, options A to B without, or A to D without understanding what exactly they are. So even boards need help. And I think sometimes this is a generational issue. You need to understand and work with it. In a lot of boards, you have, the baby boomers still on the boards, right? At times, even the veterans on the board. And you're a millennial. So what you want done is not going to happen in the same way. But by the time they realize that COVID, is here and we need to do this, that's when you then hear, the board is saying this must be implemented in the next 2 months. Okay, and that's not enough time to build a system that is focused around the client. It's something that's going to be done for the sake of doing it. I think I gave an example earlier on, maybe people didn't catch on to it, where I had a boss, who never wanted to give people laptops. Laptops to him was a status symbol rather than a tool of employment. So if you have that thinking at board level to say, oh, this is not really important, without looking at, how does this help us in the future, without having a vision of what a laptop is able to do, even a lot of companies now, and I think this is in Zimbabwe as well, and only COVID has, moved that forward to say emails on phones. I think a lot of, people here might have issues around that at their companies. So yes, what we need to do is we need to expand the understanding of IT at a board level, first and foremost. Possibly get a lot more millennials onto the boards. Here, I think government has been doing their best in Zimbabwe through what they call the corporate governance unit. They're trying to get in a whole lot more young people onto state boards for state-owned enterprises. And I think this is one of the reasons, because they need someone not just with knowledge of it, but with an understanding and an appreciation for IT and with an IT vision, so that the business can actually benefit. If you look at it right now, and I'll pose a question to everyone, a lot of these city councils, how many of them do you think have really embraced or understood the need to embrace IT? Okay, and making it easier for us to pay our bills. I think till today, I think last week I was also very frustrated. You get clamped and you have to go all the way to Roy and Martin building. Why can I not pay for that, online or in EcoCash? So it speaks to the whole process of not understanding or not appreciating what we could do by being more efficient. In actual fact, I think they could clamp more people and make more money if the process of paying was much easier, instead of everyone having to walk to Roy and Martin building because your car is being clamped. So, you have to exercise. I'm not complaining, about the exercise, but it's definitely not the most efficient system that they have there. So this is the small things where an IT leadership mindset needs to change to actually get an organization to move forward and actually benefit its own stakeholders and its top line as well. I'm hoping, I think that was that I've answered that question from, is that Simba Zengeza? Yes.
That question was from Kombo Rai Murimba. Thank you for that question, Kombo. The next question was from Shingirirai Mujaji, and it reads, with the growth in cloud computing, are there still any infrastructure constraints to digital transformation? If so, where and how best can we address it? But I think with this question, it might actually be addressed later on in this event. I think what I'm going to present might cover that, and then we can revisit that question. Thank you for that question, Shingrai. We will answer it when we get to it. Thank you. Kombo says he's been answered. So in the interest of time, I think we'll just move on. Thank you so much, Tatenda. We'll probably need a part 2 for everything that you have for us, but we'll just move on to Siobhan for now. And she is going to be covering the next focus area, which is investment in people. Siobhan, take it away.
Thanks, Tatenda. I think where we will start is really about me just putting a few thoughts out there, and I'd really like to take questions from the floor. And the people side is always an interesting topic, and there's a lot of debate and engagement around this. So I'd like us to really collaborate and for me to answer more questions than to talk. But I'll just start off with positioning a few high-level thoughts. I think ultimately we all have to accept that the way we have been working over the past few decades has fundamentally changed. I mean, with the digital transformation the way it is now, even prior to COVID, that was a trajectory that we knew was probably going to speed up at some time, and into COVID. So as a personal example, I have been working at home for the past year. So next week will be a year since I've been in the office. I find that I am much more efficient. And yes, there's obviously different challenges in different companies in different spaces, but it's really starting to think about, what does this mean for the future? So what does the post-COVID world look like? And how are we going to embrace that as organizations? I think fundamentally, if you think of each one of us on the call, our behaviors have changed dramatically over the past year. I think everything is in a digital context in almost every part of our lives. So yes, we are operating now in a much more digitally inclusive world. And when it comes down to the organization, I don't think that we should be thinking any differently. I think ultimately, digital is here to stay. So whatever shape or form that may look like in your organization, it is really about us looking to the future and saying, what do we need to do now? And how do we almost scenario plan for what the future looks like? So I'll talk about almost 3 levels of the people function. I'll talk about the organization and some thoughts around that, the team, and then I'll speak about the individual. From an organizational perspective, I think Tatenda mentioned it quite extensively in his talk about the change process and visionary leadership. And I'd like to pick up that point. Ultimately, for any organization to move into the digital space or wherever their journey of digitization is, it does come down to your leadership. So yes, there's a lot of nuts and bolts that we have to do on the shop floor to empower people around digitization. But ultimately, we need to start at the top. We need to look at what the mindset is of our senior leaders, of our executives, of our board members. If there isn't buy-in around digital at this level, the rest is going to fall flat. And I think that's the first point that we need to acknowledge. We need to acknowledge, how does digitization look in my business? And what does that mean in terms of our readiness for change? Every company is on a different trajectory in the digital space. It works for some, it doesn't work for others. Some industries we just simply can't digitize right now. But it's having the question and having the conversation rather, but how do we reimagine the business space in the context of a post-pandemic world? And ultimately, digital is not simply going to disappear when we all move to a different lockdown level and go back into office. There's still going to be hybrid ways of working. I mean, if you read the recent article in the Harvard Business Review about what does the world post-pandemic look like and how the notion of hybridity comes into play. So working remotely and in office. I think that's going to be something that's really going to be grappled with at an executive level, because also we have multi-generational workforces and not everybody buys into this notion of a remote workforce. Ultimately, I think it does come down to how companies are willing to engage on this topic first and foremost. And then the rest, I think, is about how we strategically execute that with our current workforce and how transparent we are with the challenges that currently exist. I think ultimately there's a massive culture shift here, and we need to acknowledge that right up front. Because if there's no acknowledgement of the impact of digitization on our people, then it's simply going to be, as one of the comments came through, or one of the questions rather, we need to implement X tech and we need to do it now. So it's really about the change process around your people and your IT and converging those two, where previously I think it's always been seen as separate. It's always been around IT and infrastructure and how making sure that is right for your end client. But now we need to look in-house and say, what are we doing from a team capacity, which is my next point. Are managers optimized to actually run a remote workforce, a hybrid workforce? Do the managers have the right skills around leading people in our new digital world that we find ourselves in? Obviously, there are different businesses that are operating at different levels, and they might be much more ahead of the curve, as we've mentioned some of the key players, but there's others who simply are not there yet. And that is the question around nuts and bolts, our infrastructure we have. How are our teams going to operate? How do we still keep that connectivity amongst people? Ultimately, we are social beings, so we do need to connect, and not simply over a Zoom call every now and again. And how do we manage that going forward? What skills do our management team need to help empower their staff? So yes, there's a lot to be done in this space, but ultimately, I think what we're looking for from a skill set perspective is also going to change. So no longer we're only looking for really strong technical managers who can manage process and manage output. We're also looking for really resilient individuals, people who can manage complexity and uncertainty, because we're going to have much more of that coming down the line, and individuals who have high level of EQ. So if we look at that cultural piece, Do we bring it down to the team level? And how are we supporting our staff from a management perspective? There's a lot of work to be done there. And it's really about working collaboratively right from the top, from an executive level, filtering that thinking and that vision really down to your team level. And then from the team level, looking at the people level. So nuts and bolts around what skills do we have in our current workforce? Where are the gaps? Do we understand what the new skills are that are required? So if we are saying that what our new outlook's going to be is completely digital, do we have the right people in place? And if not, how do we fill those gaps? Ultimately, we have the individuals in our business that's been making our businesses work for all this time. But now there's definitely been a gear shift. And from your company's perspective, what is that gear shift? How does it look like? And what is ultimately needed in your specific environment? And I stress that point because I think the notion of digitization is different for every single business, depending on their journey and their readiness for change. That is something that's we need to be mindful of. Also, how do we empower our workforce in this context of uncertainty, in the context of a post-pandemic world, where we know that there's going to be so much change that we aren't even aware of yet. And I specifically think about the mental fatigue that everybody's experiencing now, having to be in office one day, not the next day, all the uncertainty that COVID has brought about, and specifically on how we run our businesses day to day. So I think it's the soft stuff that maybe has been deemed soft stuff previously around the people function, which is actually becoming the hard part. And what I'm finding is in the HR capital space, we are seeing board members look to HR, or to human capital rather, much more to give direction around how we shape the new landscape going forward. So on that note, I'm just going to stop there and take some questions from the floor.
Thanks, Siobhan. Thanks, Siobhan. If we can have some questions coming through, I suppose we'll take one or two so that we can move on quickly. I will start myself, I suppose. I suppose some of the questions that I actually had you already answered in your very thorough presentations. The one that I'm thinking about now is, if we're looking at a situation where you mentioned you have to think about it. So for your organization, what is it that digitization actually means for your context? So I like the fact that you contextualized what this process would be like. But I'm wondering, moving previously low-tech employees to a full-on digital sort of situation, it requires some sort of fully immersive retraining exercise, if you will. So I'm just thinking, how disruptive do you think this would be in the bigger initiative of a digital transformation, if say we are in an organization where we're trying to go nearly completely digital? So how disruptive do you think this would actually be?
I think that's a good question, because ultimately I think I'd then ask the question of how disruptive the organization is willing to be. Ultimately, we know that somehow every single company is going to have to digitize at some point. And where is that specific company at the moment? And how do they understand what digitization means for them? So I think that's your starting point, to look at your specific company. What does it mean, the digital space for you? And then looking at, is that practical? And are your people ready? If they are not ready, there's a massive change process. You first need to bring them along. So people accept change in different levels and different ways. And I think it's important that we take people along the journey so that they process the first of all, processing the change before we actually start saying to them, you need to be upskilled in this and you need to do X, Y, and Z. Yes, that is going to come. But I think the big picture and the buy-in and the process of change is an important one. It's often overlooked when there is this need to get X infrastructure or to work remotely. people cope differently. So for example, I had a situation in my professional career last year where individuals were coming to me and saying, we actually can't cope working remotely. We prefer to be in office. And then there's complexity and conversation around that. So yes, from a capacity perspective, they may be able to, but the process of change, they may not be able to embrace that. On the flip side, you get people who are very willing to change, but their capacity to do so is something that's their intent is there, but they're not practically able to execute on that. And that becomes a hard one, because I think, like we mentioned earlier, that at some point we're going to see all roles have some type of digital element, unless you're working in a plant on the factory floor. And even that, with AI coming in, there may be need for people to gain different skills rather than do what they used to do. So I think it's definitely about, again, from the senior level, embracing change, communicating what that means for your organization, and then looking at how we can support individuals to process that change and to gain new skills to move with that change.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks for that. I see Kennedy has a question. Oh, question has been answered. Okay, thanks, Kennedy. If there is no other question from the floor, we will quickly move on to Yvonne. Okay, it looks like no more questions. Thank you so much, Yvonne. Thank you so much. Next up, we will have Yvonne Kuimba covering the next focus area, which is investment in big data and the customer experience. Yvonne, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Takunda. Is it okay if I stay off video, because I've got a very low battery and I'm also on the move, so the network might not be reliable in parts if I'm on video. So if
Sure.
that's okay, let me really start by maybe, without going into the the big data investment, I want to talk about why it's necessary. So I'll start with the customer experience objectives, where and to start that off, let me sort of explain the current circumstances that most companies have found themselves in from a customer experience perspective, particularly having had an unprecedented or unplanned for push to become digital overnight because of the lockdown. The ability to serve our customers is rapidly declines if we don't go digital, and we need to really understand what it means to go digital to be able to serve the customers. And the first issue that we've experienced is that we found that digital talent is actually scarce, which Yvonne was talking to, in terms of being very deliberate about how do we upskill. And this has affected our customers. It's also affected even our employees in terms of the pressure that they came under to all of a sudden provide those solutions for our customers overnight. So the systems and tools that we needed to then equip them with became quite critical to be able to respond very quickly to the market needs, and also to be able to reach a market that became a lot more remote because of the absence of digital as a result. And when we've got currently very thinly spread resources, as most African businesses find they have, we would find that you then under pressure to really look at how do you serve your customers remotely without the actual systems in place, and equipping those customers with laptops and equipping the support staff with laptops and getting all the channels that normally you'd support your customers with all converging into one place becomes quite a crucial challenge. So coming back to the point of ecosystem partners, I truly feel that customer experience can only really improve through the development of ecosystems, and those ecosystems require a lot of collaboration and trust across the partnerships, which Tatenda commented on earlier as well. Why I'm emphasizing this or going back into it is that the initial phases of any company's digital transformation start with awareness of the actual necessity to revise the service portfolio to enable to have that wider reach. And from a customer experience perspective, the need to sell, the digital marketing experience and digital service support services, and also being aware of who the customer is becomes quite necessary. Because when you're not seeing the customer, it's different when you've got one customer as to when you've got millions of customers and trying to create a service that applies to each and every one of those customers. So again, digital becomes quite important to be able to achieve that. So I started with just explaining the challenges within the customer experience space, and how to support the customer and the challenges to support those customers, because I wanted to really then pull back into the investment on big data, which has really become increasingly central to achieving that goal, because the big data strategy really is about converging our data ecosystem and providing a more intimate knowledge of every customer in terms of their demographics, how they transact, where they transact, how they interact with us, what is the history, and what is the market saying about our services. The ecosystem is purely centered on, or the challenges with creating a big data ecosystem becomes all involving across the different facets of the business. So if we're talking from an enterprise architecture perspective, we have the 4 layers, which are, business applications, your technology, and then your data. So all of that are part of the considerations for investing in big data, because you're not only investing in the customer's experience by changing the way that your services are delivered to the customer via a converged platforms solution or ecosystems, but you're also even changing the way that your applications interact between the customer and with your technology infrastructure, which means that a full 360 solution is necessary. And it's very hard to achieve that, especially as customers grow, or a company grows. It's very hard to achieve that ecosystem when you start off with having standalone services and applications, which in themselves are, they only fulfill one function. So when a company gets to the size of, let's say, Econet or Delta, you'll find that you've got multiple systems serving a particular objective, and it becomes a very cluttered ecosystem. The focus then becomes around system convergence and actually expanding the ecosystem, where you're serving, where you're not only doing the data orchestration, but also driving customer innovations out of that data centricity. The reason why data centricity becomes critical for the innovations is you cannot sell experience, or you cannot really reach a wider market if, as I said earlier, you're not really understanding who the customer is. So data has become more so very central to companies who are innovating in a very intimate way for the customers. So the customer experience becomes more personal, and you'll find that as I'm trying to find a good example. I'll give a telco example. It's very easy to sell, to sell services or bundles that are very broad, but it becomes a lot more important to start to cater to particular demographics, whether it's youth or it's particular professionals. And you find increasingly more and more of the services offered are more specific to a market, which is why you then start to find that as we understand who of our customers are in which industry, we start to cater even for the entrepreneurs and small, medium, and larger enterprises at the same time as our general B2C type customers. So that requires a lot of architecture around who is the customer, where are they, what do they do, what is their experience with our service, what really is their lifestyle, are they gamers, are they do they use a lot of Wi-Fi? Are they dependent on where do they shop? What could we do to enable shops, for example, in shopping malls, to be able to advertise their services and reach the customer? So the investment on the big data side is when you start off initially, as any company would start off, you would start off really with being able to knit together a very basic ecosystem where you're trying to get access to data or be able to capture data. And at that point, it's very embryonic in a sense that you can only look at historic data or events that have happened already and clean up that data and standardize your reporting. That allows you to really sort of say, how are we doing? And how much are we selling? How often and where? But when you then want to become more intelligent and start to provide those value add services and you become a more intelligent business, you start to address different types of questions rather than the ones I've just talked about. You start to talk about why are certain events happening in the way that we see them? What will happen if these trends continue? What will happen next? And what is the best that can happen, or what is the best offer that we can give to the customer? And that's when you're now getting into the more intimate service provider type of digital player, and your customer experience becomes a lot more intimate. I'll stop there for a minute because I know you've got quite a few people from different industries who might have questions on industry-specific experiences and what solutions there might be.
Okay, thanks, Yvonne. I'll quickly just get into probably one or two questions from the floor so that we can do good on our time as well. So please, if you have any questions. Okay, I'll pose one for you and then probably one more after that. So just from a very primitive sort of perspective, where does an organization that hasn't been using data at all to enhance its customer experience start? How do they build that capacity if they had none in the beginning to start with?
Mm-hmm. So it depends on the type of organization, really. But I think the very first point to start off with is just gathering raw data or being able to measure the services you deliver to the customer. We often say what we can't measure, you can't manage. So if you cannot manage your customer service or you can't measure your customer service, it means you're not yet managing it. And that starts by just understanding, the frequency of purchases, the raw data in terms of what is your customer buying from you, what is the customer's experience of your service, and getting just basic alerts in terms of managing the service and having some sort of besides the storage or storing some data, also having a data governance policy as to how much you retain and when do you I'll use the word expunge data from that is no longer really serving you. If you want to see trends, especially historic trends to guide your decision making, you may have to retain data for a while. But I would start with, just the basics, collection of data and analyzing that data and just interrogating that data. The next bit is then to start to answer those questions of, what do these trends mean and why are they happening? And start, but to get to that point requires then looking at or retaining quite a bit of historic data, and you then need quite a bit of a bigger budget than you would initially when you're just looking at a very limited amount of data to start off with. As you start to retain data, you then need to be investing in a stronger data warehousing type system. But when you start to move then to a prediction and forecasting and optimization, which is when you're really becoming a lot more advanced in your analytics, you then really need to invest in a big data solution where the processing time becomes more real time in order for you to be able to respond to the customers much quicker. So that's where you then find that solutions like Hadoop and other orchestration solutions become a lot better for you, because you want to be able to process only and retain only data you need at a given point in time, rather than storing massive sets of data as well.
Okay, thanks for that, Yvonne. I will move on to the next focus areas, which I am going to cover.
Sorry, I just have a last question to Yvonne.
Oh, right,
sorry,
yeah.
very quick. Yes. So, Yvonne, thank you for your presentation. But there's something, I really come from the soft side of things, not the hard numbers. So you've collected all this data, okay, and you're about to make a decision. It seems now companies are not getting back to the clients who they've taken this data from. Is that still, part of your process in big data to then get back to clients so that we know that, the voice of the client has been listened to? Because it now seems that it's more about collection, and then the company makes the decision over what to do without now necessarily getting back to the client to say, here's the new product that we've made. Is big data, an end-to-end? What is the end of, the process? What is the end-to-end process? Does it include also, asking the client again when you've now made a product, or you just make it as an organization?
Thanks for that, Tatenda. So perhaps let me expand on what I was saying when I was talking about now the creating a more intelligent business where you're seeing the customer 360. By that I mean, let's say you're scraping social media with your big data solution, through your big data solution, and you're picking up, what the customer sentiments are. Or you are doing your typical survey and understanding what the customer queries are, or even just collecting your or managing and monitoring your queries where the contact centers are receiving queries from the customer. You then start to become a lot more deliberate in engaging your customer and actually reaching your customer before they come to you by being more proactive. So some of it should be done without the customer even noticing that the companies are responding to my usage and my issues. But on the other hand, you then have a specific investment to be done around the services where you're now getting those ecosystem partners I was talking about, where companies should be partnering with social media partners, for example, to really understand what customers are saying or mentioning about their products and services. And you'll find that in that instance, you're now not only just collecting data, but you're also being proactive or deliberately going to be proactive about reaching those customers before those sentiments become a call to the call center. And on the other hand, if we don't invest in sufficient customer service agents, sorry, if I want to say it the other way. We need to be less reliant on customer service agents, because it becomes very static and you're waiting for somebody to make a phone call. But they're investing more in digital assistants who, and those digital assistants are virtual assistants who then look at understanding what the customer is experiencing before they even reach you. And then the role of the agent now becomes engaging on the value add aspects in terms of upselling or engaging the customer to say, we've noticed this, would you like this service, or we think this is a better option for you. We notice that you're using, I'll give you an example, you're using a smartphone, but you're only utilizing it for these services. You would get a better experience if you use you start to utilize this service for your streaming, etc. And it becomes a lot more about enabling the customer intimacy and understanding what the customer is saying. So we want to move less from collecting data, looking at what went wrong, and actually then looking at predicting and optimizing that service to the customer and reducing the engagement that the customer, or even removing the need for the customer to engage you. And if you're not seeing less footfall in a shop or contact center, then you know that you haven't yet hit the mark there. I don't know if that covers your question sufficiently.
Yes, no, thank you so much, Yvonne. I appreciate it.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Tatenda. So moving on to what I will be covering, the next focus areas are investment in business process re-engineering, investment in technology, and investment in cybersecurity. But also, just before I begin, looking at our time, we have a possibility of an overrun. So while I go, I will probably reorder this and cover investment in technology at the end, because it's sort of been covered by my colleagues. But what I would like is that the audience in the public chat just let us know if you would want us to just do a part 2 to cover everything adequately, or if we should just go ahead with an overrun of about 10-15 minutes. But I'll get right into it. So when we speak of investment in business process re-engineering, from what we understand as a business process, the re-engineering bit is simply just reworking everything that you do on a day-to-day basis, all of your little tasks, all of your little processes, to change them for one need or the other. So that's what business process re-engineering essentially refers to. And when you want to look at this, in lieu of a digital transformation or digital aspirations, you'll find that some of your business processes will start to become redundant because they are manual, or they are simply irrelevant to what you'll be trying to do. So when you get here, you would now want to start rethinking the business processes themselves. And what I have found in my experience is that the best way is to look at these processes from the little building blocks, start changing those little bits and pieces, and start expanding upwards. A lot of literature refers to this as the Kaizen method. You might want to look that up, but it's basically starting small and expanding upwards until the whole setup is changed, as opposed to changing everything in one fell swoop, one overhaul, as it were. Obviously, this needs to be done in a way that is very, very targeted to align your new business processes, or these changes, to what your business objectives are, new or pre-existing. And this is what is referred to as business process management. So this has to be done in the wider context of a very strict business process management setup. So what I then propose in this entire setup is to expose digital metrics that you find within the business process itself. And then I'll speak a little bit more about that. So if you look at the traditional business process improvement that we go through, you have, at the very beginning, when you're sort of thinking about it, you lay out your plans, and then you put whatever process it is together. The cogs are turning, and then you sort of optimize it here and there. But ultimately, what we're focusing on is the end result, where you're going to end up after this business process. So we start to look at the chronological sort of aspect of this. How long did this take? We look at how cost effective was it? How is it impacting our customer satisfaction? And there's absolutely nothing wrong with this traditional model. But what I then propose is that adding another layer which focuses on the business process itself in isolation. And this is specifically to draw out all of the little digital metrics that you can gather within the process itself. Remember, I said in isolation. So you're looking at what is going on inside that business process itself. So when you start to gather all of this data, you start to have different ways in which you can analyze and ask questions and have them answered. You will start to find that some of the data that you're gathering might be related to a totally different business process altogether. You might start to think of pivots and all of that. So the essential idea here is that with more insights, your analysis becomes more powerful, which will ultimately give you better agility in these changes and ultimately affect the end result that you traditionally would look at. And then moving on from there, I have, just to give you an example of what I'm speaking about, just consider, and this is a BPR project that I took on and completed. If you look at, consider a traditional manufacturing concern. Stuff is manufactured, thrown on a truck and delivered, and then that's it. So you have your traditional sales funnel. You know, you want to generate interest, awareness, and all of that until a sale is made. So by adding digital capability to this business process itself, we managed to start to gather a lot more information within the business process itself. So, for example, we started to get a lot of market information. We started to pick up on our customers' habits. We started to essentially know more about how this customer behaves and be able to target them very, very specifically, all off of gathering these digital metrics. And the net effect of that was to actually widen the funnel itself, because you know exactly who you're going for instead of just casting a random wide net. So how we managed to achieve this is just going to everyone's favorite platform. We went to WhatsApp, threw a little bit of artificial intelligence in there with a little WhatsApp chatbot, and then we started getting all of this information that we wanted. So if we look at try to analyze the metrics that we exposed, again, coming back to the traditional setup, you have you'd ask questions like how many outlets were visited, how many sales were made, how much were these sales, how much did it cost to actually make these sales. But again, by digitally enabling the business process itself, again, if you look at the traditional side of it, you're looking at what is at the end. But by digitally empowering this business process, we were looking at the business process itself and what comes out of it in isolation, as I pointed out. And then, sorry, I'm seeing Yvonne has her hand up. Okay, maybe you can come in when I'm finished. So by digitally empowering this business process, we started to know a lot more just in the process itself. So we started to have things like, customer contact preferences. We started to gain some predictive abilities. For example, we knew that this type of customer will typically place orders between 9 and 10 a.m. And then when they place orders in that time, they typically want our orders to be delivered around this time. So you start to have some predictive abilities, and then you also start to pick up on these preferences from this digital information that you're gathering that is actually unrelated to the product itself. So what that does is it opens up doors for further product development, or partnerships, as Yvonne pointed out earlier on, or synergies with other products that you may have. So of course, how we manage to do all of this is through the correct use of technology, which, sorry, before I get there. So what we then created is what I call the BPR agility feedback loop. And the word agility there is because of how quick it is, we then found ourselves in a position to respond to anything that we were seeing. So we had all of these insights that were coming out of our business process, and we could quickly look at them and quickly refine them. So we had sort of a loop in which we could respond very, very quickly. And to be able to do all of this, of course, we had to have had the right technology in place, which comes back to the next focus area, but I will skip past that now, and then focus on the next one, which is cybersecurity. And then depending on the time and how you guys feel, we'll come back to that. So cybersecurity, which is a big one, a bit of a nightmare out there right now. Anytime, you know, a board of directors or an executive leadership team hears the word cybersecurity, ears must perk up, boots must shake. And this is because we're now in a very, very different landscape, a very unfamiliar landscape in which we generally struggle to protect our cyberspace. So the board needs to take this very, very seriously and appreciate the new dynamic needs and coordination that needs to go into protecting our cyberspace in this modern day and age, especially with COVID-19, as well as the investment that will be required to achieve that. We will get to what this landscape actually looks like in a bit, but I want us to look at some statistics, some sobering statistics, as I would put it. There are loads and loads of them that you can look at out there, but I picked out a few and put in bold some that I want us to pay direct attention to. So typically, with the small and very large companies, I'm talking Sony, Facebook large, it takes about 6 months for a data breach to actually be detected, and then another odd 2 months for it to actually be contained. And then, of course, if you look at how much all of this is costing, you start to look at all of these statistics and you come out with a few key learning points. Some important ones being that human beings are always going to be the weakest point of your cybersecurity setup, but conversely, they are potentially your strongest defense in any given situation. Of course, remote workers are a vulnerability, a very unfamiliar one at this point. And then, you know, security specialists have to become a very important part of the modern organization now. So coming back to this landscape that I was talking about. Oh yeah, and of course, a very important one is that it is very, very costly business to actually ignore the impact and risk that cybersecurity presents nowadays. You don't want to be a part of that board that reports that you have lost $2.6 million of your shareholders' money because you did not pay attention to your cybersecurity. So it's a very costly business. All right, coming into this landscape I was talking about, I call it the expanded cyber ecosystem. So we started out in a situation where it was a very caged environment. You have your office environment, you're sharing digital information with your suppliers and your customers, and you're connected to the internet and everything. You could draw a perimeter around your cyberspace and protect it fairly comfortably. And then we then expanded this a little bit and included mobile technology, which also came with its challenges, but we were still sort of comfortable. And then along came COVID-19 and we had to work from home. Now we have the home network, and then we have the emergence of what we now call the zero trust world. And the premise of this is that previously, as I described, we felt sort of we were in a caged environment where we could be safe. And then now there's so many moving parts in this very expanded cyberspace that the assumption now, hence the term zero trust, is that you cannot draw any perimeter around any cyberspace. You are unsafe at any given point. And that is how you should approach your cybersecurity when you want to protect your information and the likes. So coming back to this home network, we have very specific threats that will come about. Human practice, for example, the cyber hygiene that you would practice when you're at your office and when you're in your home naturally would be very, very different. So you find, for example, at the office, you have the fanciest new firewall that tells you that you cannot go to specific sites because they're unsafe. But when you're at home, you don't have that. When you're at home, you can leave your laptop on the table, go and make a cup of coffee. When you're at work, you're very cagey about your password. So you're not going to just leave your workstation without securing it and everything. So that human practice, coupled with the fact that the infrastructure that you have, as I described with the firewalls and everything, is very, very different from when you're in the office and when you're at home. So because of that weak link, you will find that specifically that connectivity between your home and your office is where you find a lot of this malicious, the cyber threats and everything coming down. So coming from there, there's a very, very obvious need to recalibrate the cybersecurity setup that we have grown to know. And the recommendations that I would have, first one is to have something very, very formal in the form of a cybersecurity framework or very expanded cybersecurity policy set or whatever to form a very important part of your IT governance to protect your organization. I think Tatenda touched on this a little bit. And then further to that, this would obviously be part of the larger conversation of your corporate governance structure. And then the second recommendation I would have with regards to that, specifically relating to the vulnerable remote worker, is to expand the protection that you normally had in your office in whatever ways you can to the home itself. So what we did, for example, when we endeavored to follow these steps that I'm recommending, we had, for example, a baselining exercise where you had a simple survey to say, when you're in your home, how often do you change your Wi-Fi key? How many devices do you have? Who do you share your password with and everything? So by sort of understanding what this person's behavior is like in their home, you then start to have recommendations. So you would then build recommendations to then secure them a bit better, and then also offer things like cyber hygiene education in their home. And then the last bit, obviously, is the best choice of security technologies. You can't escape this one for the sake of the safety of your company's cyberspace. So I'm just going to check on what the feeling was with the overrun of the time. Yvonne, you have your hand up. Do you want to ask a specific question or?
Hi, Takunda. Sorry, I have to dash, but I did want to ask a question. When you were talking about your chatbot, capturing data of chatbot, how do you actually manage to control or influence securing sufficient data over digital channels when your customers, or if you're in a market that really has I'll call them Tumbudzis, as Tatenda mentioned earlier. Did you experience that?
Yes, thank you for that question. We did experience it, and actually by designing the product itself, we were very, very aware of the fact that we're targeting those customers that have smartphones. So we're very aware that our target is a very specific one. And then the idea is sort of to say, after we run this thing along for a while and we've covered that little bit of a space, because we sell the type of products that, the next 100 units that you're going to sell is going to set you apart from the next guy. So this was just another one of those channels that we had to expand into to keep growing. And then the idea is that after that, we would then start to think about, with the market that has the Mbuzis and everything, how do we start trying to evolve them? Do we start thinking USSD technologies or what?
Yeah.
So that was the thinking behind that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that.
Yeah, but thank you so much.
I've just got another meeting. Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to this forum. I'll catch up with you later if that's okay.
All right, thanks a lot.
Okay,
thanks a
cheers.
lot. Okay, so I've looked at a few comments in the public chats and I'm being encouraged to go on. So I will just finish off quickly with the investment in technology, if everyone's okay with that. I will run through it very, very quickly. So when we think about the investment in technology, as Tatenda pointed out, the key idea there is to not spend on technology for the sake of spending. It needs to be very, very aligned to what you are trying to achieve as business objectives. And you'll find that with the expedited needs that are coming through from the business side as well as the technical side, you'll now start to find that the business guy in the organization and the money guy are being drawn closer together to work very, very closely to optimize this tech investment. So you have your FDs, your CFOs and everything, and the CTOs and the CIOs having to form dream teams to actually execute this properly. And then this is just an exploration of the models that Tatenda also touched on. What we are shunning is just getting technology for the sake of it, and your people don't know what to do with it. And instead going for an approach that I call the business-led investment model, where an organization will actually first think about what it is that they do from the very, very basics, and then start to think about what technologies can they get to enhance that or enable that or operate in the environment that they're in. Just to give you a quick example that you might relate to, there's a local bank in Zimbabwe that has a Forex card, a product with a Forex card and everything. Granted, there are many banks that have this product, but in the first lockdown, what these guys then did is they opened what they called a virtual branch. So you could get on WhatsApp, register, do your banking from there. They will bring you this card, take your deposits and everything, and you could just continue as normal. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that at the beginning of whenever they, sort of conceived this idea, the main business objective was to grow the amount of Forex deposits, COVID or no COVID. So when COVID then came around, they just had to simply think, okay, in the situation that we're in, how do we still meet that business objective? And then they decided, because everyone's going digital, let's open this virtual branch, and it worked out. So the point that I'm trying to make is that business objective always has to be the driver. And then another more elaborate example is if you think of your traditional supply chain, stuff is made, put on a truck, and is delivered somewhere, and then you have an after-sales service that chases that up, see if everything is okay. So with COVID-19, borders being closed, restrictions on movement and everything, you found that the supply chain started to get backed up a lot. So every time that the restrictions would be loosened, there would be a lot of catching up that would need to be done, but it was very, very difficult to do. And you found a lot of inefficiencies, a lot of wasted resources, and then all of that. So somewhere out there, they then realized that every point in the supply chain, you are able to gather digital metrics that you can harvest and start to ask questions of. Coming back to that recommendation that I made earlier on about looking at the business process itself in isolation, regardless of its end result, and looking at focusing on gathering these digital metrics. So they came up with what they call digital supply networks. And then you have, for example, a lot of technologies that you'll find in there that will pick up digital information in this supply chain. For example, in the factories, you have digital information about which products are available and ready to be shipped, all the way to the customer. What are your stock levels looking like? Digital information that you can collect. Trucks, how many trucks are available? Where are these trucks? Where are they going? And then all of this digital information is fed into a central system controlled by artificial intelligence, and essentially the supply chain is optimized. And then you have what you call your digital supply network. But again, the business drivers will still persist. Digital supply network or otherwise, timely order fulfillment was always a thing, and it still is a thing. Cost conversion is still a thing. Tracking how satisfied your customers are is still a thing. And then, of course, every time that you want to invest in a little bit of technology and you figure out that this makes you do things a little bit better than the next guy, you're thinking strategic differentiation. So all of these business drivers remained very, very relevant, and they drove this investment in technology. So if you look at a very elaborate illustration that I got from McKinsey, you have the guy at the bottom right corner, that's you waiting for your order at home. They're telling you your order is going to be arriving at 3 p.m. But behind the scenes, within the business process itself, you have your warehouse, your trucks, your factories, all of these points in the supply chain where digital information is being collected and played around with to ultimately determine and tell you when you're going to be expecting your product to be delivered to you. again, this comes back to the recommendation that I brought out earlier on, to focus on the business process itself and just bring out the digital metrics from there. So this will then give you the overview of the process itself, when you can start to optimize a little bit better and everything. And that is the end of it. Thank you for that. So I will take questions now. Any questions?
Short one from me, Taku. Thank you for that presentation. And I think it's very, very important that we have something like that. In the financial space, I would like to know, are we able to, is there an organization in Zimbabwe that does a cybersecurity audit to know that the work that has been done is adequate to actually secure the organization? So currently, right now, I would approve something like this if my IT guy said, but I would need, a second opinion to say, yes, what you've done is adequate for now. You need to improve, later on. Is there an organization like that?
There isn't one that does it the way that I would recommend one would go about it, or the way that I would go about it personally, because a lot of the organizations are looking at it with a very traditionalist view. But what we're finding is that now, with what Siobhan brought up earlier on, for example, the context is it's now important more than it was before, in the context of the environment that we're in, one, as well as the context of what, if you're going digital or trying to protect your digital information, what that digitization actually means to you. So with regards to the organizations in Zimbabwe covering that bit of it, I can't say I've come across any that I would confidently say they would do it the way that I would recommend. Maybe I just have not come across them. But no, I can't think of any off the top that would go about it the way that I think I would ought to go about it if I were given that task. Okay, but so we do have organizations that carry out cybersecurity audits. And as I pointed out, I feel a lot of these are very traditionalist. They're not as dynamic as they ought to be. I brought out in my cybersecurity presentation that the dynamism is a bit more important in the space that we're in now. And my hope is that they will probably catch on as time goes. At least I hope they are actively trying to catch up in that regard.
Noted. Thank you so much.
Okay. There's a question that Shingirai had asked earlier on. It read, with the growth in cloud computing, are there still any infrastructure constraints to drive digital transformation? If so, where and how best can we address it? So Shingirai, thank you again for that question. The reason why I had said let's defer it to later, because I figured, even starting from Siobhan's presentation, there are issues that would touch onto your question. So for me personally, maybe Siobhan will want to add, I'm not sure. For me personally, in terms of infrastructure, I don't think the constraints are as serious as they were before. It's more of a conversation around your people, because if you have the infrastructure and you can literally change overnight the systems that you're using, it's the people that are going to matter the most in that regard. And then specifically speaking to cloud computing, I mentioned in my cybersecurity presentation that we are now in this zero trust world. So it's more about the cybersecurity around the cloud services that you're going to go with and the technologies that you have protecting you. So for me, it's not an infrastructure question at all. I don't believe it is an infrastructure question. I think it is the main function being the people that you're going to have involved in that, participating and protecting your setup, as well as the cybersecurity practice that you have in your organization under your IT governance and the likes. I hope that answers your question. Feel free to unmute your mic, Shingra, if you want to. Okay, yeah, he's good. Any other questions? We do have a contribution from Robert. He says he agrees that there needs to be more companies that specialize in assessing cybersecurity maturity. Thank you, Robert, for pointing pointing that out, putting it that way. Cybersecurity maturity was a term that I was looking for, the assessment thereof. Any further questions?
Yeah, Taco. Hi, sorry, just a quick one here. Actually, two, and it's both of them are sort of loaded questions. The first one is, don't you think it starts with organizations looking at their business model first, asking themselves the question, do we need all this infrastructure that we have? Can we optimize, which means lowering costs? In most leaders' situations, optimization means lowering costs and improving systems. So for me, it's an aspect of starting with your business model and then working back and seeing or forward and seeing what I have already, do I still need? Because we're moving into a digital age. And I think, as one of the speakers mentioned, we always knew this age was coming. So this adjustment was always supposed to have been foreseen.
Yeah, I think thank you, Kennedy, for that contribution. I think it's been, I definitely agree, and I think it's been overemphasized by myself as well as Siobhan and Tatenda, that the focus should be what you are trying to do, what your core competencies are, and what all of this stuff means to you in your context, before you get the shiniest new toy that is out there. Okay, do we have another question? We are terribly over time now. So if we don't have another question, I will quickly close this and start by saying thank you all for attending this webinar. We really, really appreciate it. And a big thank you again to the panelists that I had with me today. You guys were very great and very informative and very interactive. I really, really appreciate you taking the time. Tatenda, Siobhan, thank you so much. Just for everyone, the recording will be made available. I did make a recording of this session and it will be available to whoever requests it. I will keep the meeting open for a bit just so that people can drop their emails if they would like, to receive that recording or a link to the recording. But otherwise, thank you so much for your time and we'll see you at the next one. Cheers.
Thank you.